Hey folks, today I'll be going through the Yooka-Laylee Toybox and giving my impressions about the game's design decisions. The Toybox is a technical demo showcasing the title's core mechanics, so this video does not contain any spoilers for the main game. Yooka-Laylee is a spiritual successor to the 3D platformers developed by Rare for the Nintendo 64. Its development team consists largely of former developers from the Banjo-Kazooie and Donkey Kong Country series. This is immediately apparent when entering the game. The music is highly reminiscent of Banjo-Kazooie. I had to actually go back and compare the soundtracks myself to confirm that they weren't identical. One of my first surprises was the number of design inspirations that seem to have come directly from Nuts and Bolts. Yooka's spinning attack is distinct from Banjo's roll, and more similar to the default attack featured in Nuts and Bolts. The title's original Kickstarter emphasized large worlds, particularly through its expansion mechanic, which seems to come from that game too. The levels in Banjo-Kazooie and Banjo-Tooie were never particularly large, because the characters were designed to move slowly and more thoughtfully. The slow-paced nature of those games, and focus on puzzle solving over complex platforming, was for me one of the most significant distinctions from Mario 64. Nuts and Bolts naturally had to change that due to its vehicle mechanics. Yooka-Laylee feels like it's trying to strike a compromise between the two visions. The movement feels a lot more fluid and fast-paced than either of the original Banjo games. It's also significantly easier to chain movements together. It'll be interesting to see how this meshes with the overall level design. One of the key features of the original games was the density of each individual world, and how they made it seem like all exploration, no matter how small a nook and cranny the player ventured into, would offer rewards. I think this is one of the key differentiations that enabled the series to become so successful, so I hope they bring back the same design mindset in this game. Nuts and Bolts, by contrast, is regarded pretty negatively by players. Despite being a pretty good standalone game, it wasn't a very good Banjo-Kazooie game. That doesn't mean it didn't make positive changes. The switch from a roll to a spinning attack provides a lot more affordance in a three-dimensional environment, making it harder for players to miss their opponent. The point of these games has never been combat. Enemies act largely to make things interesting, keep players moving, and make the environments feel more alive. Bringing this into Yooka-Laylee makes sense, even if the original inspiration was a flawed package overall. One of the features that I really liked was the use of individual quills instead of the packaged notes that were used in Banjo-Tooie. Banjo-Kazooie used musical notes to incentivize players to explore worlds thoroughly. Collecting all 100 felt like a genuine achievement. The flaw in this implementation was that a player's collected notes would get reset once they left a world, meaning that if they accidentally missed one, they couldn't quit the game until they'd scoured the entire map. Banjo-Tooie tried to fix this by not only allowing permanent collection of notes, but also grouping them into packages to reduce the overall collection burden. The problem is that the designers could no longer use a handful of notes to incentivize off-the-beaten-path exploration, so note collection overall lost a lot of its value. The decision by Yooka-Laylee to bring back individual quills is a really good one, and it's an indication that the designers have thought about the potential world density problems I mentioned previously. I can't say for sure whether or not the main game will make use of these, but the fact that the developers implemented them in the first place makes me think that they'll be using them at least some of the time. As long as collection persists between world entries and exits, it'll be a perfect compromise between the two original games. One of the differences I noticed with Banjo-Tooie was the lack of an edge-grabbing mechanic. This was particularly noticeable due to the Toybox's use of geometric shapes, so it's hard to say how much this will matter in the final product. Being able to grab an edge was a nice affordance for newer players because it made the title's more difficult platforming sections a lot easier. The downside was that it broke up the moment-to-moment pacing in a negative way. Because it was usually safer to jump for an edge rather than try to land a jump successfully, some of the more interesting platforming sections had a jarring start-stop feel to them. It'd be nice if they managed to skip this feature entirely through the use of smart level design. While I understand why its inclusion might make sense to people, it really just ends up acting as a safety net for bad platforming. If a section is too difficult, it should either be made easier or the player should be expected to get better. The inclusion of edge grabbing just allows the designer not to fully think through what they expect from players, and allows sloppier platforming sections to slip through balance testing. Another interesting design choice in the platforming was the use of double shadows. The lighting engine provides realistic shadows based off the player's angle with the sun, but the game also provides a second, circular shadow underneath the player to make it easier to determine their mid-air position. Speaking personally, I thought this was pretty confusing, and I found myself directly looking at the secondary shadow instead of judging its position out of the corner of my eye, since I couldn't be sure which shadow I was seeing without looking at it directly. It seems like the developers want the graphical nicety of realistic shadows, but they recognize how difficult that makes mid-air navigation, so they decided on a compromise solution of just including both. I can't say for sure how this will feel once I've put several hours into the game proper, but my gut tells me that picking one or the other would be better than including both. Usually in a platformer, players become familiar with the mechanics over time and adjust their play accordingly. If they know the shadow doesn't reflect their mid-air position, they'll at least get used to where it is relative to where they actually are, providing some value in navigation. Providing both prevents this from happening, or at least makes it a lot more difficult. So I wonder if it would be better for the developers to cut the secondary shadow completely. While I was playing around with the shadows, I also had an opportunity to mess around a bit with the camera. Now the Banjo games have never had a particularly strong camera angle, probably because the Nintendo 64 only featured a single analog stick. It's pretty hard to go back to that once you've experienced a proper three-dimensional camera in more modern games. Even when there are no obstacles around, freely looking around can be pretty difficult. It's even more clunky while platforming, although I wonder how much this has to do with the geometric shapes, and the fact that the camera is configured to block against the world rather than move through it. Based on the fact that the developers specifically requested feedback in this area, I'm guessing it's something that they're still seriously working on. I might as well mention performance since it did stick out to me. Banjo-Tooie was infamous for its low frame rate and frame drops, and thankfully the performance of the Toybox puts concerns about that to rest. After multiple playthroughs, I encountered virtually no performance issues. I was especially impressed by the game's draw distance, and the fact that quills could be seen from an entire map's length away. The Toybox only features a single area dedicated to enemies, but I still managed to be impressed with the decisions made around enemy AI. As I mentioned earlier, these games have never really been about the combat, but that doesn't mean that it shouldn't be implemented in a compelling way. The AI has been designed to at least attempt to avoid the player's attacks, making it feel a bit more satisfying to play against. Another small detail I noticed about the music, it subtly transitions between one section of the Toybox to another. I'm sure this has been done in many games, but for me personally I associate it with the Banjo series, so it felt pretty cool to see it make a comeback. The last thing I'll mention is the Toybox's secret. Now this section does technically contain a spoiler for the main game, so if you really want to be on blackout, I recommend that you stop watching now. Once the player collects 100 quills and the single pagey, the game directs them toward finding a secret switch. The path leading there is blocked off until the player can access it, meaning that aside from a minor audio cue, the player has no idea that something is there. This runs counter to the way secrets were typically implemented in the Banjo games. The original series didn't just emphasize finding things, it was about noticing them, realizing a necessary ability or item was missing, and then anticipating the ability to come back later and unlock something. Banjo-Tooie was particularly good at this, including a decent amount of backtracking, but also connecting the different worlds to prevent too much player downtime. The Toybox's secret doesn't give the player the opportunity to anticipate finding it. Furthermore, it's quite difficult to find to begin with. By contrast, Banjo games usually provided a camera perspective that gave the player a general idea of what they had just unlocked. Even the last Cheeto secret in Banjo-Kazooie provided plenty of clues to its location if players were paying attention. The entrance to Cheeto could be viewed ahead of time. The game established a pattern of raising water levels to access new areas, and the limited time that was provided indicated how far away the secret should be. What's given to the player in the Toybox is just the color orange, useless considering that it had previously established that the interior of buildings didn't necessarily need to be the same color as the exterior. It seems like the point of this secret is for players to scour every inch of the world in order to find it, which goes against the design patterns repeatedly established in the original series. People may argue that this isn't reflective of the final game's design, but I would take issue with that too. The secret that's given to the player is just as obtuse as the one in the Toybox, except that this time it applies to the main game. What this means is that in at least one instance, the developers actively plan to include a secret like this in the full release. It would be reasonable to expect that there are more. In principle, I don't take issue with this design pattern. This is coming from someone who has no issue with the existence of Ash Lake. But this isn't Dark Souls, it's a spiritual successor to Banjo-Kazooie, a game that included numerous design features that revolved around seeing something, not being able to do it, learning something new, and then coming back and finding something cool. They did it that way because these are collectible platformers, where a major part of the game is finding things, not just exploring for the sake of exploring. It's a core reward loop in these titles, and it's how secrets were implemented. The fact that the one secret the developers chose to implement in the Toybox wasn't done this way makes me wonder whether they've decided to change this design pattern, and I'd have to ask why. Overall, I was pretty impressed with the Toybox demo. It had the right overall feel, and the core mechanics didn't lose their luster even after 4 playthroughs. There are definitely some areas I'd like to see some improvement, particularly around the way secrets are handled, and I'm looking forward to see what the developers come up with when the full game releases. Thanks for watching! If you enjoyed this video, please consider giving me a follow here or on Twitter to receive regular content updates. The relevant links are in the description below. All the best, and see you next time.